Napoleon marched into Russia with 600,000 men, a force so vast it seemed unstoppable. Yet when the snows came, only 1 in 10 would stagger home. The real enemy wasn't Russian soldiers, but the land itself. Endless plains stripped bare by scorched earth, frozen rivers swallowing supply wagons, blizzards burying entire regiments alive. How could geography defeat history's greatest general? What turned this grand invasion into a desperate retreat through a white hell? The answers lie in Russia's merciless terrain, a silent killer that outmaneuvered Napoleon's brilliance. This is the story of an empire defended not by armies, but by winter's teeth. The largest army Europe had ever seen. Napoleon assembled over 600,000 soldiers for the invasion of Russia, creating the largest army Europe had ever seen. Forces came from across his empire, including French troops alongside conscripts and allies from Poland, Germany, Italy, and other conquered territories. Nearly half these soldiers were foreign contingents of questionable loyalty, not the battle-hardened French veterans who had won previous campaigns. The sheer scale of this force demonstrated Napoleon's confidence in his military dominance, but it also created immediate problems. The French emperor expected a swift victory, assuming Russia would surrender within 30 days like other European nations had done. His staff prepared accordingly, with limited supply trains and no contingency plans for a prolonged campaign. This fundamental miscalculation ignored Russia's unique geography and the unwillingness of Tsar Alexander to negotiate. Past victories in Central Europe, where distances between capitals measured hundreds rather than thousands of miles, gave Napoleon false confidence about moving such a massive army. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin before the army even crossed into Russian territory. The Neman River, marking the frontier, required 4 full days for the entire force to cross. Stragglers created gaps miles long in marching columns as the army struggled to maintain cohesion. Horses died at alarming rates, with some units losing over 30% of their cavalry mounts in the first month from exhaustion and lack of forage. One French cavalry officer wrote in his diary, "We bury more horses each morning than we groom. The men grow weary digging graves before breakfast." The campaign had barely begun, yet logistical cracks were already appearing. French planners had underestimated nearly every requirement for sustaining such a force in hostile territory. Their supply system could only deliver about 25% of needed food, forcing soldiers to rely on foraging in hostile country. Transportation bottlenecks developed as thousands of wagons competed for space on primitive Russian roads. A supply officer's report noted, "The road to Vilnius resembles a marketplace overturned by giants. Broken carts, dead horses, and abandoned crates litter every mile." The army's baggage train stretched for miles behind the marching columns, slowing progress to just 15 to 20 miles per day, a pace too slow to achieve Napoleon's ambitious timetable. Most critically, few soldiers carried adequate winter gear. Some officers packed dress uniforms for expected victory parades rather than warm clothing. This oversight reflected Napoleon's belief he would complete the campaign before winter arrived. Yet even during summer marches, men suffered from heat exhaustion, dysentery, and other illnesses that would leave them vulnerable when temperatures dropped. The Army's medical corps remained woefully understaffed to handle mounting casualties, with one surgeon reporting, "We have bandages for 50 men and wounds for 500. As the force crossed into Russia, it encountered the first signs of trouble. Villages stood empty of inhabitants and stripped of supplies. Wells had been poisoned. Fields that should have offered forage had been burned. Napoleon's superior numbers suddenly became a liability, more mouths to feed with fewer available resources. A Polish lancer described the scene. "We found villages like skeletons, the bones of houses standing, but no flesh of food or people upon them." Starvation and disease spread through the ranks as the army's size, designed to intimidate enemies, now worked against it. The Grande Armée's command structure, tightly centralized around Napoleon himself, struggled to adapt to these challenges. Orders took hours to reach distant corps commanders through a system designed for smaller battles in familiar terrain. Coordination between units suffered as distances expanded and communications faltered. What had worked brilliantly in the confined battlefields of Europe now showed dangerous flaws when applied to Russia's endless expanses. A staff officer lamented, "By the time our couriers return with replies, the situation they describe has already changed." Napoleon's ability to concentrate overwhelming force was turning into a vulnerability. Supply. Officers reported critical shortages of everything from bread to gunpowder. Cavalry units lost mobility as their horses starved. Artillery pieces became stranded when teams of horses collapsed from exhaustion. The campaign was barely 3 weeks old, but already Russia's vast geography was taking its toll. A gunner wrote home, "We drag our cannons now like sledges, with men where horses should be." Small clashes with Russian rear guards revealed another problem. French veterans still fought well, but Allied troops showed reluctance in the face of growing hardships. Prussian and Austrian contingents in particular demonstrated questionable morale as supply shortages worsened. One Bavarian soldier's letter home confessed, "We fight not for glory but for the crusts in our pockets." Napoleon had paper strength in numbers, but an army held together by coercion rather than loyalty. The invasion force was becoming its own worst enemy through sheer logistical strain. By mid-July, barely a month into the campaign, ominous reports reached headquarters. The Russian army wasn't offering battle as expected, but kept retreating eastward. Each day's march revealed more empty landscape stripped of resources. Soldiers grumbled about endless marching without the decisive engagement Napoleon had promised. A veteran grenadier was overheard saying, "We march to beat the Russians, but the only thing we beat is our feet against these damned roads." Officers noted plummeting morale as men saw no end to the campaign ahead. The Army's medical services buckled under mounting casualties. Hospitals overflowed with sick men suffering from heatstroke, dysentery, and typhus. Burial details worked constantly to inter those who succumbed, yet corpses still lined the roadside. Looters targeted their own supply wagons, further reducing available provisions. Discipline eroded as hunger replaced fighting spirit among many units. A provost marshal's report stated bluntly, "The men steal from the dead now, and soon they'll kill for the living." Napoleon remained confident, unwilling to acknowledge his first major miscalculation. He pushed the army deeper into Russia, refusing to consider winter quarters while still chasing the elusive decisive battle. His insistence on maintaining such a large force in the field, despite clear supply problems, reflected the arrogance that had brought him to power. Now that same trait began working against him as logical voices among his staff went unheard. One aide wrote privately, "The Emperor sees maps where we see starving men." The campaign's early stages revealed a fundamental truth. Russia's defense lay not in its army, but in its geography. The same distances that frustrated supply columns also prevented Napoleon from forcing a battle. The same scorched earth tactics that starved his troops preserved Russian strength for later. Napoleon had built history's largest army for Europe's shortest campaign, but Russia refused to fight on his terms. A Russian peasant's diary entry observed, "The French take our land mile by mile and starve foot by foot." By August, Napoleon faced an agonizing choice. He could turn back, admitting failure after months of exhausting marches, or he could push on toward Smolensk, gambling that a deeper advance would finally make the Russians stand and fight. He chose the latter, compounding his earlier mistakes with greater risks. The army crossed the Dnieper River, leaving behind any hope of easy withdrawal as supplies grew scarcer with each mile. A quartermaster's ledger from this period shows the grim arithmetic. August 15th, flour for 3 days, meat for none. The Grande Armée that had awed Europe with its discipline was disintegrating in Russia's vastness. What remained was a hungry, exhausted mass struggling through ever more hostile territory. And the worst was yet to come as summer faded and the true test of Napoleon's planning approached. The army marched toward Moscow, unaware it was walking into geography's trap. A Russian scout watching their progress reported, "They move like men already defeated, their banners drooping like weeping willows." The illusion of quick victory. Napoleon based his invasion plans on past European campaigns, where swift marches and decisive battles had brought quick victories. In territories like Italy or Germany, a few hundred miles separated major capitals. But Russia's vast scale made his usual strategies impossible. The first signs of trouble appeared at the Neman River, where crossing the entire army took 4 full days, 4 times longer than similar operations in Western Europe. Engineers struggled to maintain pontoon bridges while thousands of men and horses waited in chaotic conditions, consuming precious supplies before even entering hostile territory. The logistical nightmare only worsened as the march continued. Russian scorched earth tactics left the landscape barren, and within weeks, horses began dying from lack of forage and overwork. The army had brought approximately 300,000 horses, but cavalry and artillery units watched helplessly as their mounts collapsed. One lieutenant in the 8th Hussars wrote in his journal, "We lost 40 horses yesterday, not to enemy fire, but to exhaustion. The men whisper that soon we'll be marching on foot, dragging our own cannons." Without horses to pull supply wagons, the army's lifeline began to fray. Some regiments lost over a third of their mounts before facing any significant combat. Marching columns stretched over dozens of miles as discipline unraveled. Stragglers fell behind to scavenge for food or rest, creating dangerous gaps in the formation. Cossacks picked off these isolated men like wolves culling stragglers from a herd. Even veteran units, accustomed to tight formations in Europe, found themselves scattered across the endless terrain. What had been designed as a concentrated striking force now resembled a fraying rope, its strands pulling apart with each mile. The army's daily progress of 15 to 20 miles, reasonable in Western Europe, proved disastrous in Russia. There, such distances meant endless days crossing identical, barren landscapes. Each mile further from supply depots stretched the already inadequate logistics to the breaking point. Supply trains that should have taken days instead took weeks, if they arrived at all. A quartermaster's report from July noted, "The Third Corps has received no flour in 8 days. Men are boiling their belts and eating grass, when they can find it." French planners had assumed local foraging would sustain the army, as it had in prosperous Central Europe. But Russian troops and peasants removed or destroyed everything before retreating. Vilna's warehouses burned with 400,000 rations still inside, enough to feed the army for days. Russian commanders knew hunger would weaken the invaders more effectively than battle, and they exploited it ruthlessly. Unfamiliar weather compounded the suffering. Unlike temperate Western Europe, Russia's summer heat baked men in heavy wool uniforms while dust clouds choked marching columns. Then, without warning, thunderstorms turned primitive roads into impassable mud, trapping supply wagons for days. Soldiers muttered about cursed skies, unaware these were mere previews of the horrors to come. Medical services collapsed under the strain. Too few doctors accompanied the army, and field hospitals lacked even basic supplies. Typhus spread through crowded bivouacs, killing thousands who had survived the marches. Injured or sick men who couldn't keep up were left by the roadside, easy prey for Cossacks or exposure. One surgeon wrote, "We bury 30 a day now, when we have the strength to dig. The rest, the crows will take them." Napoleon dismissed these reports as temporary setbacks. Having never campaigned in such terrain, he insisted conditions would improve once they forced the Russian army to battle. His staff knew better but hesitated to contradict him. Some commanders quietly reduced march distances to conserve strength, a silent rebellion against the emperor's orders. The land itself became an adversary. Endless forests and swamps forced detours that added miles to each day's march. Rivers required time, consuming pontoon bridges, since few could support the army's weight. When Russian forces appeared, they struck at vulnerable points before vanishing again, denying Napoleon his cherished decisive engagement. By mid-July, entire units were shadows of their former selves. A Prussian officer noted some regiments had more men in hospital trains than in the ranks. The army's paper strength remained impressive, but its actual fighting power had bled away with each grueling mile. Napoleon pushed east toward Smolensk, certain it would turn the tide. Yet each step forward only deepened the trap. Russia's vastness swallowed the invaders whole. Roads wide enough for 60 men marching abreast in Germany narrowed to muddy tracks barely accommodating 4. Messages between corps commanders took half a day to deliver, making coordination impossible. The Grande Armée, designed for rapid European campaigns, was unraveling in a war of endurance it couldn't win. As supplies dwindled, Russian commanders refined their strategy. Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov understood they didn't need to defeat Napoleon. The land was doing that for them. Their scorched earth policy became more systematic, transforming geography from obstacle into executioner. The illusion of quick victory had evaporated, replaced by an inescapable truth. In Russia, even the earth fought back. Scorched earth. The landscape fights back. The Russian army's retreat transformed the landscape into a barren wasteland erased by fire. Commanders implemented a calculated strategy of systematic destruction. Villages stood empty with food stores removed or burned, wells poisoned, and fields reduced to ashes before French forces arrived. This environmental warfare targeted the invaders' fundamental need for sustenance, turning the land itself into a weapon. French foraging parties, which normally provided 50% of the army's food through local requisition, found nothing but devastation when ranging ahead of the main columns. Some detachments traveled 20 miles from main routes without finding usable provisions, returning empty-handed to alarmed supply officers. The complete absence of food sources forced total reliance on inadequate supply trains already struggling before entering Russian territory. The destruction of Vilna's warehouses demonstrated the thoroughness of Russian preparations. Nearly 400,000 rations burned in the city's storage facilities, enough to feed the entire army for several days. French quartermasters watched helplessly as this critical resource disappeared in smoke, with remaining supplies either contaminated or inaccessible. Similar scenes repeated at every major stopping point along the advance, with Smolensk, Vitebsk, and other towns offering no respite from the shortages. Transport units could only deliver about 25% of required food supplies. Under ideal conditions, each soldier needed 2 pounds of bread daily along with meat, vegetables, and brandy rations. Actual distributions fell to half rations by July and continued shrinking. Soldiers awakened to find their wheat flour rations soaked from overnight rains, with no ovens available to bake bread. Many ate the paste raw, worsening dysentery outbreaks already ravaging the ranks. Starvation forced desperate measures. Cavalry units slaughtered horses that could no longer walk, butchering up to 100 mounts daily in some regiments. The meat provided temporary relief, but weakened mobility and logistics long-term. When horseflesh ran out, soldiers boiled leather harness straps and cartridge pouches to make thin broth. Some chewed on grass or tree bark. Looting became endemic despite strict orders against it, with men ransacking abandoned homes for hidden caches of grain or livestock. Russian engineers followed a precise pattern of destruction during their retreat. They demolished bridges after rearguard units crossed, burned mills and bakeries with their machinery smashed, and directed peasants to drive livestock eastward or slaughter animals rather than let them fall into French hands. Even beehives were destroyed to deny honey. Nothing remained intact that could aid the invaders. This went beyond military necessity into the systematic denial of an entire region's life-sustaining resources. Disease spread through undernourished troops packed into makeshift camps. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections flourished where thousands of weakened men shared close quarters without sanitation. Hospital tents overflowed with patients lying in their own filth. Doctors lacked medicines, clean bandages, or even clean water. Burial details worked continuously but couldn't keep pace with the mounting deaths. Many soldiers simply collapsed by roadsides during marches, left behind as the columns moved forward. Napoleon's supply system, designed for rapid campaigns through fertile European territories, couldn't adapt to this devastated landscape. Wagons intended to carry extra rations for a few days now needed to sustain an army for weeks. Horses starved without forage, collapsing in harness and leaving supply trains stranded. The army consumed its reserve supplies by early August, with no way to replace them. Quartermasters reported some units hadn't received bread rations in 8 days. Communication lines stretching back to Prussia became unreliable as partisan raids increased. Courier detachments required heavy escorts to get through. Messages took weeks to travel between Napoleon and his depots. The lack of accurate information about supply status worsened decision-making. Napoleon continued pushing east, unaware how badly his logistics had deteriorated. By the time reports reached him, conditions had usually worsened further. Weather conditions amplified the difficulties. Summer rains turned primitive roads into quagmires, bogging down supply wagons. Dry spells produced choking dust clouds that blinded drivers and sickened men. The Russian climate was proving as hostile as the landscape. Worn-out uniforms disintegrated under constant marching, leaving many soldiers in rags before autumn arrived. Boots wore through soles, forcing men to wrap their feet in straw or looted clothing. The Russian strategy succeeded precisely because it targeted the French army's greatest vulnerability: its size. No supply system could sustain 600,000 men operating so far from home. Every destroyed village, poisoned well, or burned field multiplied the logistical strain. French planners had assumed the Russians would contest every inch of territory, not surrender it in a calculated retreat. Each mile forward meant another day's rations needed from non-existent sources. By late August, combat effectiveness had declined noticeably. Units took longer to form up for marches. Skirmishes with Russian rear guards produced disproportionate casualties among weakened French troops. Artillery batteries reduced their firing drills to conserve ammunition when supply columns failed to arrive. The mighty Grande Armée was being reduced to a mob of hungry, sick men through pure attrition. Medical services collapsed entirely in some corps. Surgeons lacked instruments, medicines, and even bandages. The sick-filled churches and barns turned into makeshift hospitals. Healthy men avoided these pest houses, knowing infection was almost guaranteed. Typhus spread from hospitals back to frontline units through returning convalescents, creating a vicious cycle of reinfection. Death rates approached 30% in some regiments without fighting a single major battle. Discipline eroded as hunger bit deeper. Desertions increased despite harsh punishments. Soldiers wandered from columns searching for food, only to be picked off by Cossack patrols. Entire companies refused orders to march until issued rations. Officers reported men collapsing during simple drills. The army that had marched into Russia as the finest fighting force in Europe was becoming a starving rabble through the simple lack of food. Napoleon remained strangely detached from these realities. He continued issuing orders as if commanding a fully supplied army. His staff hesitated to convey bad news, exacerbating the disconnect between headquarters and frontline conditions. When commanders pleaded for rest days to allow stragglers to catch up, they received reminders about the need for speed. The refusal to acknowledge logistical realities compounded every other problem. Peasants added to the misery when possible. Those too old or infirm to evacuate sometimes remained behind to misdirect foragers or sabotage occupied villages. Well contamination became common, forcing the French to dig new ones under guard. False rumors about Russian troop movements wasted precious time on reconnaissance missions. What little cooperation Napoleon expected from local populations failed to materialize. By early September, the army's effective strength had halved without major battles. Stores captured at Smolensk provided temporary relief, but couldn't reverse the overall decline. Napoleon faced a critical choice: continue to Moscow hoping for decisive battle, or begin retreating before winter. He chose advance, gambling that capturing the old capital would break Russian resolve. The decision committed his weakened forces to deeper penetration of hostile territory just as weather patterns shifted. The land itself had become Napoleon's primary opponent. Russian troops remained elusive, but their scorched earth tactics produced devastating effects. Starvation and disease accomplished what gunpowder could not: the slow disintegration of a superior army through relentless environmental pressure. Geography was proving to be Russia's most powerful weapon, surpassing artillery or cavalry in its destructive potential against invaders unprepared for its scale. As the army moved toward Moscow, another factor entered the equation. Morning frosts appeared in early September, weeks earlier than expected. Icy winds hinted at the brutal winter approaching. Napoleon's men still wore tattered summer uniforms, their horses scarcely able to pull empty wagons, let alone full supply loads. The scorched earth had starved them. Now the weather prepared its own contribution to the unfolding disaster. The land had winter arrives early. The first snowfalls came in early October, weeks ahead of schedule. Napoleon had planned to conclude the campaign and return to France before winter, but now his army faced a crisis. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, almost overnight. French officers found ink freezing in their pens within minutes. Soldiers accustomed to mild European winters now shivered in summer tunics. Only 10% had proper coats. Like mariners caught in an Arctic gale, they were unprepared for nature's assault. Men froze during routine marches, collapsing where they stood. Veterans of Austerlitz and Jena fell victim to the cold alongside raw recruits. Sentries stood stiff at their posts by morning. Exposing hands to adjust equipment risked instant frostbite. Campfires melted surface snow only to create icy traps that refroze around men's legs. The Grand Army faced an enemy no soldier could fight. Frostbite cases outnumbered combat wounds 15 to 1. Surgeons worked endlessly as fingers, toes, and limbs turned black. Men wrapped feet in straw or book pages, temporary measures that delayed rather than prevented necrosis. Wounded officers ordered servants to keep them awake, knowing sleep meant death. General Seger described the landscape as a vast winding sheet, concealing frozen corpses. The change came with terrifying speed. On October 25th, veterans reported comfortable marching conditions. By November 3rd, those same men died by the roadside. Weapons turned against their bearers. Muskets burned uncovered hands. Gunpowder grew damp. Artillery oils froze solid, rendering cannons useless. Horses perished in droves. Nearly all artillery teams died within 2 weeks. Cavalry regiments marched on foot. Starving soldiers butchered frozen carcasses where they fell, hacking meat stiff from rigor mortis. Without horses to pull ambulances, wounded men were abandoned with a day's rations if fortunate. Winter exposed Napoleon's logistical failures. Stockpiles of greatcoats sat unused hundreds of miles west. Some Guards regiments received fur-lined coats, while entire divisions nearby wore summer tunics. Replacement shipments crawled along icy roads, if they moved at all. The cold transformed warfare. Russian irregulars, clad in felt boots and furs, struck isolated French units before vanishing into white landscapes. Frozen rivers became death traps, too thin for wagons but thick enough to block escape. Discipline evaporated. Elite units dissolved into desperate mobs. Soldiers from Napoleon's own imperial guard looted bread wagons rather than starve. Medical services collapsed. Field hospitals lacked fuel for heating. Frostbite cases took precedence over battle wounds due to sheer numbers. Bandages stuck to frozen flesh. Medicines froze solid. Blood congealed on instruments before they could be wiped clean. Psychological effects proved as deadly as physical ones. Brave men broke down weeping or wandered away in a daze. Suicides increased sharply below -20°C. General Seger noted the landscape-induced despair and hopelessness that sapped all will to continue. Bizarre survival methods emerged. Soldiers ripped stuffing from abandoned furniture to line coats. Engineers built small stoves inside wagons for the wounded. These improvisations saved some, but couldn't offset the overwhelming cold. Most merely delayed death by hours. Russian advantages grew as French weaknesses multiplied. Their supply lines shortened while local knowledge located shelter and provisions. Even peasants became deadly, hunting stragglers for equipment. Weapons malfunctioned constantly. Muskets misfired, bayonets shattered, leather straps snapped like twigs. Night brought the greatest peril. Without tents, soldiers slept in huddles. Sentries required relief every 30 minutes. Morning roll calls revealed men dead from hypothermia, despite being surrounded by comrades. Some entire platoons failed to wake. The lucky found shelter in peasant huts, only to contract typhus from lice. Nature's assault varied with cruel ingenuity. Blizzards erased visibility for days. Thaw cycles turned roads to bogs before refreezing into jagged ice fields. Sunny days caused snow blindness without raising temperatures above lethal levels. The landscape offered no sanctuary, only varying forms of slow death. Starving soldiers took desperate risks. Men staggered into minefields for frozen turnips. Cavalry mounts disappeared despite guards. Daily rations fell below 800 calories. Barely enough energy to march, let alone fight. Logistics collapsed entirely. Supply trains that once took 3 weeks now required 6. Of 20 departing Kovnar in November, only 3 reached the army. Cold rendered medicine useless. Wounds festered under frozen bandages. Amputations became near-certain death sentences. Typhus spread as men huddled for warmth. Russian pursuit intensified. Cossack units launched continuous attacks, their steppe ponies outmaneuvering crippled French cavalry. By December, the armies' condition defied comprehension. Frostbitten men marched alongside corpses they hadn't realized were dead. Some retained discipline until the end. One guardsman was found frozen at attention. Others simply sat down to await death. The retreat became Darwinian selection. Hardy northern conscripts outlasted Mediterranean troops. Large men perished faster due to greater calorie needs. Smokers fared slightly better. Nicotine reduced frostbite risk. Napoleon himself nearly succumbed. His physician documented severe frostbite during the Berezina crossing. Like his men, he lacked proper gear. His famous grey overcoat was no thicker than standard issue. Only constant movement and better food spared him. Other senior officers weren't as lucky. Dozens of generals died from exposure. Winter ultimately claimed more victims than all battles combined. Of 100,000 retreating from Moscow, perhaps 20,000 crossed back in fighting condition. Russian weapons accounted for barely 10% of losses. The rest fell to cold, starvation, or disease. Geography's slow, inevitable grinding of human endurance. Survivors carried lifelong scars, missing fingers, chronic respiratory conditions, frost-damaged joints. The mental trauma ran deeper. Veterans spoke of nightmares decades later. Some historians argue the Russian winter broke the Grand Army's spirit more permanently than any defeat. The experience fundamentally changed those who endured it. Modern analysis shows the early winter was normal for the region. Napoleon's planners simply lacked accurate climatic data. Moscow records showed similar cold snaps in 30% of previous years, not an anomaly. The failure lay in assuming Western European weather patterns rather than preparing for local conditions. This geographical ignorance proved more devastating than any Russian strategy. Moscow. The empty victory. Napoleon marched his army into Moscow on September 14, 1812, expecting to receive the city's surrender and begin peace negotiations. Instead, his troops found an eerily quiet city nearly devoid of inhabitants. Of Moscow's 275,000 residents, fewer than 15,000 remained, mostly criminals, stragglers, and those too sick or poor to evacuate. The French vanguard reported empty streets where they had anticipated cheering crowds and welcoming officials. One lieutenant described stumbling upon a deserted marketplace, where looted stalls stood open to the wind, their torn awnings flapping like ghosts in the autumn air. Napoleon himself took quarters in the Kremlin, unaware the Russians had already begun executing a devastating plan to deny him any benefit from capturing their capital. Within hours of the French entry, fires broke out across Moscow. Russian patriots and remaining police officials set flame to key buildings using prepared combustibles. Fires spread rapidly through the mostly wooden city, consuming whole districts in hours. French soldiers attempting to fight the flames lacked proper equipment and organization. The conflagration grew so intense that Napoleon himself had to evacuate the Kremlin temporarily as flames approached its walls. Within 3 days, approximately 80% of Moscow's structures were destroyed or damaged beyond use, including nearly all potential winter quarters for the army. The destruction of Moscow's supplies proved catastrophic. French quartermasters searching the city found empty grain warehouses and storehouses. The Kremlin's cellars contained fine wines, but little flour or preserved meat. What few food stocks remained were contaminated or inaccessible beneath burning buildings. Soldiers who had dreamed of warm billets and full stomachs now wandered through smoldering ruins, their hunger growing alongside a dawning realization that this hollow victory might cost them everything. Discipline collapsed rapidly as soldiers realized no provisions would be forthcoming. Men broke into abandoned homes and shops, stealing valuables rather than necessities. Some froze to death wearing stolen furs and silks, but without proper winter footwear. Others drank themselves unconscious on looted alcohol, becoming easy prey for the cold and remaining Russian partisans. Entire regiments dissolved into mobs more concerned with survival than military duty. Officers attempting to maintain order often faced open insubordination from desperate men. The fires created additional logistical nightmares. Over 2/3 of Moscow's housing stock burned, leaving no shelter for the occupying army. Soldiers crammed into the few surviving buildings, creating ideal conditions for disease transmission. The city's water system was destroyed, forcing troops to drink from contaminated wells or melted snow. Medical facilities burned along with hospitals, leaving thousands of sick and wounded without treatment. Napoleon's headquarters received constant reports of men dying from exposure just steps from potential shelter. Napoleon's decision to remain in Moscow for 5 weeks became his most critical mistake. Each day of delay brought worsening weather conditions and further deterioration of his army. The Russian refusal to negotiate became apparent early, yet Napoleon hesitated to abandon his prize. His staff noted the emperor spending days pacing in the Kremlin, waiting for messengers that never arrived from Tsar Alexander. This indecision squandered valuable time that could have been used for an orderly retreat before winter set in. The army's condition deteriorated sharply during the Moscow occupation. Without proper rations, men weakened daily. Disease spread through overcrowded bivouacs. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections cut through ranks already depleted by months of campaigning. Medical officers reported mortality rates tripling within weeks of entering Moscow. The few functional hospitals overflowed with patients lying on frozen floors without blankets or medicines. Frostbite cases appeared weeks before the harshest winter weather arrived. Russian cavalry patrols constantly harassed French foraging parties outside Moscow. Cossack units intercepted supply convoys attempting to reach the city from the west. By early October, fewer than 1 in 3 supply trains were getting through. The army's remaining horses starved for lack of fodder, reducing mobility and transport capacity. Artillery batteries began abandoning guns as draft animals died. Napoleon's forces were becoming trapped in the ruins of Moscow, their lines of communication and supply collapsing. The civilian population that remained proved actively hostile. Groups of armed townspeople ambushed isolated French soldiers. Well poisoning became commonplace. False information about Russian troop movements wasted French time and resources on fruitless reconnaissance. The few attempts at establishing local government failed completely. No Moscow notables remained to cooperate. Napoleon's vision of reorganizing Russia under his administration collapsed with the realization he couldn't even control the ruins of its former capital. Napoleon finally ordered the retreat on October 19th, but by then the opportunity for an orderly withdrawal had passed. Early winter storms had already begun, dropping temperatures below freezing. The delay meant the army would be marching west during the worst possible conditions. What remained of the Grand Army now consisted of perhaps 100,000 combat effectives and 40,000 non-combatants, all in declining health and morale. They dragged behind them a miles-long baggage train filled with loot from Moscow, but precious little food or winter gear. The retreat from Moscow quickly became a disorganized rout. Soldiers abandoned their units to search independently for food and shelter. Stragglers created gaps miles long in the marching columns. Discipline collapsed entirely as men focused solely on survival. The Russian army, now reinforced and resupplied, began coordinated attacks on the vulnerable French flanks and rear. What had been an occupation force in September became a fleeing mob by November. Napoleon's miscalculation in Moscow stemmed from fundamental misunderstandings about Russian geography and society. He expected Moscow to function like other European capitals, a political center whose capture would compel surrender. But Russia's sheer size meant the government could continue operating from other locations. The willingness of Russians to destroy their own capital demonstrated a national resolve Napoleon hadn't anticipated. The logistical consequences of occupying Moscow proved devastating. The burned city provided no shelter or supplies while consuming enormous resources to garrison. French supply lines stretching nearly 600 miles back to friendly territory were unsustainable, especially as Russian forces attacked them relentlessly. Napoleon had committed his army to an untenable position, not recognizing how geography negated his usual strategic advantages. Napoleon's strategic indecision in Moscow reflected his growing disconnect from reality. Reports of worsening conditions were dismissed or ignored. Officers who advocated immediate retreat were silenced or removed. The emperor convinced himself the Russians would still surrender even as his army weakened daily. This cognitive rigidity cost precious weeks better spent preparing for winter operations. The psychological impact of the Moscow disaster cannot be overstated. French soldiers who had endured hardship all campaign now saw their sacrifices rendered meaningless. Entering Moscow was supposed to end the war. Instead, it began a worse ordeal. Morale plummeted as men realized they must retreat back through the same devastated countryside they had marched through in summer, now in winter conditions. This spiritual collapse may have been more damaging than material losses. Moscow's occupation also had severe diplomatic consequences. Napoleon's aura of invincibility shattered when European courts learned he had taken the Russian capital yet gained nothing. Allies began reconsidering their positions, while neutrals grew less intimidated by French power. The strategic calculus of the entire Napoleonic system shifted based on the Moscow stalemate. Napoleon's continental system of economic warfare against Britain lost credibility as France's military dominance came into question. The Russian leadership understood exactly what they had achieved by abandoning Moscow. Field Marshal Kutuzov recognized the French army would wither in the ruined city, while Russian forces could regroup and resupply. The Tsar's refusal to negotiate, despite losing his capital, demonstrated Russia's unique strategic depth. Napoleon found himself in the unprecedented situation of winning every battle yet losing the campaign through pure geographical overextension. When the retreat finally began, it exposed how thoroughly Moscow had become a trap. Roads west were now blocked by fresh Russian formations. Supply depots established during the advance had been plundered or destroyed. The same vast distances that strained French logistics in summer became impassable in winter. Nearly 50,000 men had died or deserted during the Moscow occupation, losses the army could not sustain. The 5 weeks in Moscow represented a crucial inflection point in the campaign. Had Napoleon retreated immediately after entering the city, he might have preserved more of his army. Alternatively, had he properly prepared for winter occupation, he could have waited out the coldest months in relative security. Instead, his prolonged indecision committed the army to retreating during the worst possible conditions. This single strategic error accounted for much of the catastrophe that followed. Napoleon's experiences in Moscow permanently altered European warfare. Military theorists would later study the campaign as the definitive example of overextension and failed occupation strategy. The concept of capturing an enemy's capital as the decisive war aim was discredited in situations where strategic depth existed. Future planners would account for logistic limitations and geographical realities, rather than assuming political collapse would follow battlefield success. The victory in Moscow also demonstrated the limitations of Napoleon's leadership style. His centralized decision-making failed when confronting novel strategic circumstances. The refusal to acknowledge changing conditions or heed warnings from subordinates proved disastrous. His belief in his own infallibility prevented necessary course corrections until too late, a pattern that would repeat later in his career. Modern analysts note the Moscow occupation parallels other failed invasions of Russia, from Charles XII of Sweden to Hitler's Wehrmacht. The consistent factor in all these disasters is underestimating Russia's geographical advantages, the vast distances, climate extremes, and willingness to sacrifice territory for strategic gain. Napoleon encountered these factors in their purest form, making his Moscow experience a cautionary tale for all would-be conquerors. The retreat begins. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon gave the order that would begin history's most catastrophic military retreat. After 5 weeks occupying a ruined Moscow, his dwindling army of 100,000 men turned westward towards Smolensk and the relative safety of French-controlled territory. Winter was approaching, supplies were exhausted, and Russian forces had regrouped. The retreating columns stretched for miles, slowed by wagons overloaded with loot from Moscow rather than essential supplies. Soldiers carried silver candlesticks and fine fabrics, while their boots disintegrated from weeks of marching. The single road to Smolensk became a frozen gauntlet. Baggage trains extended up to 10 miles behind marching columns, easy targets for Russian cavalry raids. Stragglers fell behind at alarming rates, with some reports suggesting 5,000 men were lost daily without enemy contact. These weren't combat casualties, but victims of exhaustion clawing at tree bark for food, or feverish soldiers collapsing face-first into snowdrifts. Typhus and dysentery spread through the malnourished ranks like wildfire. Field hospitals overflowed with patients lying exposed to freezing temperatures. Surgeons worked constantly, but could only perform crude amputations. One account describes a man biting through a leather strap as his frozen leg was sawed off with an unsterilized bayonet. The sick who couldn't walk were abandoned at roadside with maybe a day's rations if they were lucky. Russian forces waged a war of calculated torment. Cossack cavalry materialized from blizzards to strike vulnerable points, then vanished like ghosts. Peasant partisans ambushed foraging parties. French diaries tell of soldiers found nailed to barn doors with their own bayonets. Regular Russian units under Kutuzov systematically blocked escape routes while avoiding direct confrontation, letting the land do their killing. November's early. Snows transformed the retreat into a frozen nightmare. Rivers that should have supported crossings became death traps, ice cracking underfoot to swallow entire platoons. Forests offered no shelter as bitter winds sliced through summer uniforms, now reduced to blood-stained rags. Muskets became useless as lubricants congealed. Men clubbed each other with frozen corpses over scraps of horse meat. Of 20 supply convoys sent from Kovnar, only 3 arrived intact. Soldiers gnawed on leather straps or boiled dead horses for broth. The official ration fell to 8 ounces of bread daily by late November, less than half the minimum needed for survival. An officer's journal records finding men dead around campfires, their mouths stuffed with bark and grass. December's -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures brought fresh horrors. Men froze standing upright during brief rests, their eyes glazed over like marble. Artillery units abandoned guns when the last skeletal horses collapsed. The few surviving cavalry mounts were walking skeletons. One cuirassier was seen carrying his dying horse rather than leave it behind. Napoleon's leadership wavered as the army unraveled. His characteristic decisiveness gave way to puzzling hesitation. At critical moments, he would sit motionless for hours staring at maps. During the disastrous Berezina crossing, aides reported him passively watching as pontoon bridges collapsed under fleeing masses. The master of Europe's battlefields seemed paralyzed by an enemy he couldn't outmaneuver, winter itself. The army's physical transformation shocked observers. Veterans of Austerlitz were now skeletal figures with blackened frostbite scars, teeth falling out from scurvy. The walking dead clutched frozen muskets as crutches. One grenadier marched 30 miles on stumps after his feet rotted off. Of 400 Imperial Guard cavalry who crossed into Russia, only 40 would survive the retreat. Daily attrition reached apocalyptic levels. The 100,000 who left Moscow had dwindled to 40,000 by Smolensk, fewer than 10,000 combat effective. Entire divisions vanished without battles. The 8th Corps lost 8,000 of 10,000 men to cold and starvation alone. Russia was achieving Waterloo-level casualties through environmental attrition. Russian commanders showed chilling restraint. Kutuzov's main army shadowed the retreat like a wolf tracking wounded prey, attacking only when the French stumbled. At Berezina, they could have annihilated the trapped remnants. But why risk men when the river was drowning hundreds before their eyes? The survivors who reached Smolensk found no salvation. The promised depot contained moldy flour and frozen vodka. After 3 days' rest, the march resumed toward Vilna, dooming thousands more to the frozen road. One officer wrote, "We no longer buried the dead, just stacked them like cordwood to mark the trail for those behind." Russia's vastness became the ultimate weapon. Each westward mile required superhuman effort from starving men, geography's merciless arithmetic grinding them down. Napoleon occasionally slowed the disintegration with tactical brilliance, but nothing could reverse it. The same traits that crushed European armies proved fatal against the Russian winter. The psychological toll was perhaps worst of all. Hardened veterans broke down during endless night marches. Some shot themselves rather than face another dawn. Officers reported men laughing hysterically as they plunged into frozen rivers. This trauma would haunt survivors for decades, their accounts spreading through Europe like a warning. Modern analysts see Moscow's retreat as environmental warfare perfected. Russia won by drawing Napoleon into an ecological trap where distance and weather did the fighting. The same principles would doom invaders in 1915 and 1941, proof that geography could destroy armies more thoroughly than any battlefield. The retreat's climax would come at Berezina River in late November, where the frozen waters would claim thousands more. As Russian forces finally closed the trap, the river became a slaughterhouse of desperation, its icy currents carrying away the last remnants of Napoleon's once mighty army. Berezina, crossing the river of death. The Berezina River crossing represented the final catastrophe of Napoleon's Russian campaign. By late November 1812, what remained of the Grande Armée reached the frozen river, with Russian forces closing in from 3 directions. Field Marshal Wittgenstein pursued from the north, Admiral Shishogov blocked the western bank, and General Miloradovich advanced from the east. Approximately 40,000 French combatants and 40,000 non-combatants faced the crossing with winter temperatures dropping below -20 degrees Celsius -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The river should have been frozen solid enough to walk across, but unseasonable thaws left dangerous patches of thin ice that couldn't support heavy loads. French engineers led by General Ebel worked against impossible odds to construct 2 wooden pontoon bridges across the 100-meter-wide river at Studienka. Working waist-deep in freezing water under constant Russian artillery fire, they used salvaged barn wood and demolished village houses to build the spans. Their tools froze to bare hands, and many engineers collapsed from hypothermia during 3 days of continuous labor. The artillery bridge took shape first, appearing somewhat stable by November 26. The second infantry bridge followed hours later, its planks slippery with ice and blood from injured workers. Panic erupted when Russian forces were spotted approaching. Thousands rushed the unfinished bridges before commanders could establish order. The artillery bridge collapsed under excessive weight shortly after midday, sending scores of men and horses plunging through ice floes into the river. Witnesses described trapped men clinging to broken timber until their frozen fingers lost grip. Engineers worked through the night to restore the span while French rear guards fought desperately to hold off Wittgenstein's advancing troops. November 27th saw renewed attempts to cross under deteriorating conditions. Shishogov's forces intensified artillery barrages from the western bank, targeting both bridges and the massed troops waiting to cross. Russian gunners had the range precisely measured, dropping rounds directly onto the crowded approaches. A French officer recorded watching an entire company of veterans disintegrate under one well-placed barrage. 60 men wiped out in seconds while queuing for the crossing. The bridges became choked with corpses that had to be periodically cleared to maintain foot traffic. Discipline collapsed completely when the infantry bridge failed on November 28. A sudden shift in the current broke several supporting pontoons, sending hundreds tumbling into the freezing water. Strong swimmers found their limbs locking up within 30 seconds in the icy flow. The amount of gear soldiers carried made survival nearly impossible. French cavalry attempted rescues, but their weakened horses could make little headway against the current. French commanders took brutal measures to maintain order. Marshal Victor's rearguard corps held off Wittgenstein's troops at bayonet point, while engineers frantically repaired the bridges. Staff officers enforced strict crossing priorities. Artillery first, then Imperial Guard units, then line infantry. Thousands of stragglers found themselves barred from approaching, left to fend for themselves against the Russians. The West Bank became a killing ground as Shoshagov's forces tightened their encirclement. Marshal Ney's battalions formed squares to repel cavalry charges, while their own remaining artillery provided what cover it could. Russian dragoons singled out isolated groups, overrunning them before nearby French columns could react. The frozen marshes alongside the river trapped many wounded men who couldn't move to safety before freezing to death where they fell. November 29th marked the final phase of the disaster. With Russian pressure intensifying, Napoleon ordered the bridges destroyed despite thousands still waiting on the east bank. Engineers set fire to the spans around 8:30 a.m., condemning approximately 10,000 stragglers to capture or death. Some attempted to swim across as the bridges burned, their silhouettes visible through the flames before disappearing under the ice. The crossing claimed approximately 25,000 French lives over 3 days, half combatants, half civilians and stragglers. Another 25,000 became prisoners of war, many perishing in captivity. The river itself became a mass grave, its spring thaw later revealing thousands of corpses embedded in ice or washed up on banks. These losses came atop months of previous attrition. Of the 600,000 troops who invaded Russia that June, perhaps 40,000 soldiers remained effective after Berezina. Napoleon's leadership during the crisis showed flashes of his earlier brilliance mixed with growing desperation. His decision to deceive the Russians about crossing locations initially succeeded, buying critical time. Yet he also abandoned thousands of his own men when destroying the bridges early, prioritizing army remnants over individual lives. Russian commanders missed opportunities to inflict even greater damage. Shoshagov hesitated to commit reserves that might have completely annihilated the French beachhead. Wittgenstein showed uncharacteristic caution against Victor's rearguard, allowing thousands more to escape than necessary. Their combined forces still inflicted devastating losses while suffering relatively light casualties themselves. About 6,000 Russian dead and wounded versus 10 times that number of French losses. The crossing's aftermath revealed the full scale of collapse. Discarded weapons, uniforms, and personal effects lined both riverbanks for miles. Frozen corpses stood upright where they had fallen, only melting months later. French staff officers burned regimental records and code books rather than let them be captured. Berezina became emblematic of the entire Russian campaign's failures. The French language adopted Berezina as shorthand for catastrophe. Veterans writing memoirs decades later still described nightmares about the frozen river. The disaster resulted more from geography and weather than Russian military action. The river, the ice, and the cold did most of the killing. Logistical deficiencies sealed the French fate well before arriving at the river. The Engineer Corps had started the campaign with insufficient pontoon bridging equipment, gambling they wouldn't need it in Russia's winter conditions. Without these fundamental preparations, no amount of bravery or sacrifice could overcome Berezina's physical challenges. The crossing marked the true death of the Grande Armée as an effective fighting force. While Napoleon would raise new armies in 1813, these lacked the experience and esprit de corps of the veterans lost in Russia. The campaign survivors struggled for years with physical and psychological wounds, missing limbs from frostbite, chronic respiratory conditions from freezing lung damage, or what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Strategically, Berezina confirmed Russian victory in the campaign, while Napoleon personally escaped to fight another day. His army ceased existing as a coherent unit. The myth of his invincibility shattered completely. European powers that had tolerated French domination now saw opportunities to rebel. Tactically, the crossing demonstrated both French resilience and Russian military limitations. Ebel's engineers achieved near miracles constructing functional bridges under hellish conditions. Yet Russian forces showed poor coordination between commands, repeatedly failing to concentrate against vulnerable points. The event's historical significance grew over time. Military academies studied Berezina as the ultimate lesson in failed campaign planning. Napoleon's refusal to acknowledge retreat until too late became shorthand for disastrous strategic inflexibility. German planners in 1941 would explicitly cite the 1812 campaign as what to avoid during Operation Barbarossa, then repeat many of the same mistakes against the same unforgiving landscape. Napoleon's Russian campaign proved no army could defeat geography itself. Of 600,000 men who crossed the Neman River, fewer than 100,000 returned. Russia's vast distances, brutal winter, and scorched earth tactics accomplished what no enemy general could: the destruction of Europe's most powerful military force without a decisive battle. Supply lines snapped, horses starved, and men froze where they stood. Modern militaries still study this campaign as a warning. Terrain and climate are merciless adversaries. Like a storm swallowing an army whole, Russia's geography remains its greatest defender, a lesson etched in ice and blood. No conquest